Okay, so we already took a quick look at this table last time. Not only the other names that have been given with our complexes 1 through 4, also lists starting from C, the second mobile electron carrier. And I pointed out that all these 4 complexes are rather large protein complexes that we find in the mitochondrial membrane. They also consist of a number of subunits, have relatively high molecular weights. And what is really important is to realize that all these complexes, and then also including cytochrome C here, contain prosthetic groups or cofactors that enable these proteins to accept and donate electrons. And that's key here in this electron transport chain. So we're looking at a number of iron-sulfur clusters. We have in a few of these also flavine mononucleotide, flavine adenine dinucleotide. We have heme groups with the iron that can change the oxidation state, and we also have in complex 4 copper ions that can change between copper 2+ and copper 1+ and accept and donate respectively electrons. So this is really important, and we'll see importance of this also when we take a look at the individual components of the electron transport. So we'll go through these step by step and tell you what is known about these components and what is important here for us in this class. So, as I said, electrons stemming from mitochondrial NADH, so NADH that is produced within the mitochondrial matrix, are channeled into the electron transport chain via complex 1. This is overall an L-shaped protein, and we see that electrons here that come from NADH in the mitochondrial matrix are transferred first to flavine mononucleotide, and from there, via a couple of iron-sulfur clusters, they're transferred to our first mobile electron carrier, ubiquinone. So, a couple of things are important here, namely, first of all, that we have already learned that when NAD+ is being reduced to NADH, it's actually a hydride ion, an H-, that is accepted by the nicotine amide ring. So we have a transfer of 2 electrons at a time when NAD+ is being reduced to NADH, and also a hydride is being donated, meaning 2 electrons at a time when NADH is being oxidized back to NAD+. Okay, so the transfer acceptance of electrons as it comes to NAD+ and NADH always involves 2 electrons at a time in the form of a hydride ion. So a hydride you can envision as a proton hydrogen cation that has 2 electrons, or you can look at it as a hydrogen atom that has an additional electron. Okay, so it has 2 electrons, and they are both transferred to NAD+ to reduce it to NADH, or they're both taken away at the same time when NADH is being oxidized to NAD+. So this also happens when these electrons are actually donated to complex 1, and the component that actually accepts these 2 electrons in the form of a hydride is this flavine mononucleotide. So we've seen the structure of flavine mononucleotide before. Here actually it's dinucleotide, so the mononucleotide would just miss this adenosine monophosphate portion here. So what we see here shaded in green would actually be the flavine mononucleotide, which we also find in complex 1. And we've seen this picture, a similar picture, which is what you usually find in textbooks, that explains how flavine mononucleotide or flavine adenine dinucleotide can be reduced or oxidized, if we go from right to left, in a stepwise manner, going through a semiquinone form here. Okay, so flavine adenine dinucleotide and flavine mononucleotide are capable of accepting individual electrons and protons, hydrogen cations, to be first partially reduced to form the semiquinone form, and then fully reduced by taking up another electron in the proton. Okay. So a model like this here does not explain how NADH could actually transfer hydride anion to the isoalloxacene ring here, which is actually our important player in FAD and FMN. And for that reason, I've also included a picture that actually shows that this isoalloxacene ring can also accept hydrides from NADH. Okay, so that happens actually in complex 1 when NADH donates the electrons to this flavin mononucleotide. It's a transfer of a hydride. It's a transfer of 2 electrons at a time. We fully reduce the FMN to FMNH2, and then this isoalloxacene ring can donate individual electrons here to iron sulfur clusters, and there are something between 5 and 7. I think the exact number is still not known. Which then ultimately transfer electrons here to ubiquinone. So there's another iron sulfur cluster here that does this job, and it's called N2, so N2 is also an iron sulfur cluster here. But what you have to realize is that only this first step, the transfer of electrons from NADH to FMN, is actually the transfer of 2 electrons, and all subsequent transfer reactions are single electron transfers of the electron transfer chain. Okay. So, we talked about iron sulfur clusters before. Do you remember when we talked about iron sulfur clusters?
The Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle.
Krebs cycle, yes. There's an enzyme that has an iron sulfur cluster. Do you remember which one?
Is it a conitase?
Conitase, yes. And I told you that a conitase has a 4 iron 4 sulfur cluster, so a cubic structure actually, which helps to hold the substrate actually in place on the active side. And I already indicated when we talked about the citric acid cycle that we will also see iron sulfur clusters again when we talk about the electron transport chain. And the function of these iron sulfur clusters and these iron sulfur proteins is different, namely to enable the acceptance and donation of electrons. Okay, so while the oxidation state of the iron in the conitase doesn't change, it doesn't have to change, it doesn't change to the best of my knowledge at least. This is a key element here in the iron sulfur clusters that we find in the electron transport chain, namely that the iron that we find in these clusters actually changes in oxidation state. So iron 3 plus can take up an electron, be reduced to an iron 2 plus, and the iron 2 plus then can donate the electron again. So there are a number of different iron sulfur clusters that are found in proteins. So here this schematic is taken from your textbook. I found that the most common structures supposedly are 2 iron 2 sulfur structures as shown here, 4 iron 4 sulfur clusters. So these cubic structures that we also saw for a conitase, and then there are also 3 iron 4 sulfur and also 8 iron and 7 iron containing iron sulfur clusters. Now in most cases, and that's something that I discussed already in the context of a conitase, the iron sulfur cluster, which contains of iron sulfides, okay, will be held in place through interaction with cysteine residues coming from the protein. But we will see later actually that there is also, I will mention, I don't think we're going to see this, we'll also see one example where it's actually histidine residue that also interacts with the iron sulfur cluster in one of these complexes. Okay, so let's come back to this real quick. So why are these iron sulfur clusters then? As I said, electrons one at a time are transferred to our first mobile electron carrier. Mobile, I mean, when I say mobile, I mean that this carrier, this component transfers electrons between complexes that we can envision to be rather stationary in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So this is probably an oversimplification. Okay. But our first mobile electron carrier is a low molecular weight compound that has several names, okay? Coenzyme Q or ubiquinone, okay? Here at the top we have the fully oxidized form. You can see that it's based on the benzoquinone ring. There's two methoxy group, a methyl group, and then an isoprenoid chain. So overall this is a very hydrophobic molecule and is believed to be dissolved in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so it's hydrophobic enough so that it can be dissolved in the hydrophobic core of the inner mitochondrial membrane and can take up electrons, one electron at a time, and go through a semiquinone form here. There's a radical. We're taking up first one electron, and then the semiquinone can take up another electron, two protons, to be fully reduced here to, again, something that has been given a number of names. One is dihydroquinone, because we have the two hydrogens now. You can also call it ubiquinol. That's a name that I would usually use to indicate these two hydroxyl groups here. And the abbreviation usually is something like QH2 or CoQH2 for the reduced form of coenzyme Q. So this is a reversible redox reaction here as shown. So the electrons, of course, can also be given to other components of the electron transport chain. And we'll see how this works when we talk about complex 3. But first, let's talk about complex 2. So complex 2 is actually identical with succinate dehydrogenase. We talked about succinate dehydrogenase in the context of the citric acid cycle, and we point out that this is the very same enzyme actually that is also known as complex 2 in the electron transport chain. So we know that here we produce an FADH2, okay, and the electrons of the FADH2 can then also be transferred to coenzyme Q, to ubiquinone, to reduce it, and then ubiquinone can transport these electrons to complex 3. So this yellow golden structure here represents our complex 2, which we can call succinate dehydrogenase or succinate coenzyme Q reductase, which describes a little better what actually happens. So we convert succinate to fumarate, and then we use these electrons to reduce coenzyme Q, so therefore why not call it succinate coenzyme Q reductase. It's also a relatively big protein. It's not overly large, it has 140 kilodaltons, just to put this in perspective. Typical antibody molecule, immunoglobulin G, the most prevalent antibodies that we find in our blood, has a molecular weight of about 150 kilodaltons, and they are pretty large. Okay, so this is certainly not the largest protein we find in the mitochondrial membrane, but still it's a big protein. And it also contains a number of subunits. These 4 subunits has this flavin adenine dinucleotide, so it's a flavor protein. But it also contains a number of iron sulfur clusters. I think, again, the exact number is not known, and it also contains a heme. Okay, so we've already talked about the other possibilities, or some other possibilities, how coenzyme Q can be reduced. Okay, we talked about complex 1 just a moment ago. We talked about the glycerol-3-phosphate shuttle system last time, which is one way to utilize cytosolic NADH and have electrons from cytosolic NADH enter the electron transport chain. But we also talked about other possibilities, how, for example, electrons from FADH2 that is produced by mitochondrial beta oxidation of fatty acids can be transferred to coenzyme Q. So these two complexes are not the only possibility to reduce ubiquinone to ubiquinol. Okay, but for the time being, let's stay with complex 1. So there's another representation of complex 1. We see that there are some cytosolic subunits also. Cytosolic side, the matrix side would be here. And in one subunit, in the A subunit, we actually have the binding site for succinate, and we have this flavin adenine dinucleotide, which is reduced to FADH2, and from there, single electrons at a time are transferred to at least 3 iron sulfur clusters, and from one of these iron sulfur clusters, electrons are transferred then to ubiquinone. So there's a binding site for ubiquinone, and ubiquinone takes up a total of 2 electrons. 2 protons is reduced to ubiquinone. We also see that relatively close to the binding site of ubiquinone there is a heme, okay, heme type B. We'll see what that means in a moment. But this heme supposedly does not participate in electron transport, but its role is rather to make sure that electrons don't go astray and no reactive oxygen species are formed. Okay, so it's pretty much a trap for electrons also. Make sure that they are just not released to the environment. Okay, so what happens now with ubiquinone, the reduced form of ubiquinone, transports electrons to our third complex, complex 3. And from there, electrons are transferred to a second mobile electron carrier, cytochrome C, which is a protein. Okay, so our first mobile electron carrier is a low molecular weight compound. Our second mobile electron carrier is a small protein. We'll see the structure of that protein in a little while. But let's first talk about complex 3. So it's actually a dimer consisting of identical monomers. So it's a homodimer, and each monomer, and here shown is only one monomer, alone has 11 subunits in a molecular weight of about 250 kilodaltons. Also contains hemes and at least 1 iron sulfur cluster. And we'll see how these prosthetic groups actually participate in electron transfer of electrons coming from ubiquinone and being transported to cytochrome C. So we don't want to confuse these different cytochromes. I'll tell you what a cytochrome is in a moment. But they're different. These are proteins, okay? And they contain heme, and the heme in cytochromes actually participates in redox reactions. So there are other heme-containing proteins, certainly no myoglobin, hemoglobin, that participate in the storage or transport, respectively, of oxygen. Now, there are other heme-containing proteins called cytochromes, where the heme actually participates in electron transport. Now, the oxidation state in hemoglobin, for example, of the iron, the central iron, our heme does not change, or is not supposed to change. So the active oxidation state of the iron in hemoglobin is iron 2+. Okay, if the iron 2+ in hemoglobin is oxidized to an iron 3+, to produce methemoglobin, methemoglobin doesn't bind oxygen anymore. So the active form actually has a particular oxidation state. Now in cytochromes, it's different because the iron in the heme participates, is key actually for the acceptance and donation of electrons. So an iron 3+ is our starting point, which can take up an electron, is being reduced to an iron 2+, and then the iron 2+ donates the electron to another component and is reoxidized. So the oxidation state actually in cytochromes changes. And they're different cytochromes, and we'll see that they can be characterized based on their spectral properties, and they can have different hemes. And based on the heme component they have, they are characterized or called actually either cytochrome A, B, or C, and then we can divide these further and call them, for example, cytochrome C1. So cytochrome C is the protein component I referred to previously as our second mobile electron carrier. Here we have another cytochrome C1, okay, which also contains a heme group of type C, but it's a different protein. So don't be confused by this, okay? So cytochrome C is not cytochrome C1, okay? So these are different proteins. And we see that in this complex 3 here, we actually have at least 2 different types of cytochromes. One that is shown here in green, see it right, which is called cytochrome B. So this is a heme-containing protein. And another one is cytochrome C1, which is shown here in blue, which is also a heme-containing protein. But then, in addition, we have a third important subunit out of these 11 that participates in electron transport, and it's an iron-sulfur protein, which has been called Rieske iron-sulfur protein, after Helmut Rieske, one of the pioneers in the field of electron transport, the electron transport chain. We see that we have a 2 iron 2 sulfur cluster. This is the iron sulfur cluster that I referred to previously, that is also held in place in the protein through interaction with a histidine residue. Okay. So we'll see another representation schematic of this protein in a moment, but first I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about cytochromes. So as I said, cytochromes are heme-containing proteins that participate in redox reactions, and the heme that most students at this stage actually know, have seen previously, is a heme B. Okay, so this is a classical heme that we usually discuss first when we talk about myoglobin and hemoglobin. So this is the type of prothetic group that you find in both myoglobin and hemoglobin. It's an iron protoporphyrin 9, meaning we have a tetrapyrrole ring system, so 4 pyrroles that are bridged here by these methanol bridges here. We have a couple of substituents about these rings here, so we form a tetrapyrrole, a porphyrin ring system, and we have 4 methyl groups, we have 2 vinyl groups, we have 2 propionic acid residues. So this would be protoporphyrin 9. We make it a heme actually by binding an iron here, which as I said, in hemoglobin and myoglobin would be iron 2+ in the active form, but in cytochromes can actually change the oxidation state. So we have 4 of the total of 6 complexation sites in our iron occupied here by our ring nitrogens. And then, as you may remember, in hemoglobin we have another nitrogen actually coming from a histidine residue, and then on the 6th coordination site we can have oxygen or actually other small molecule like carbon monoxide or cyanide bind here. Now the binding of cyanide will be of relevance when we talk about some related stuff in a little while, so keep that in mind. This is not the only heme that exists, okay, and these 3 actually are not the only ones that exist, but these are the most common, those that we typically find in biological systems. There is another heme that has slightly different substituents here that's called heme A. So we also have a couple of methyl groups here, we have a formyl group here, we have a propionic acid residues, we have a vinyl group here, and then we actually have an isoprenoid residue here, which is hydrophobic and allows this heme A to be anchored in hydrophobic portions of proteins. So this is a pretty stable, also non-covalent interaction also that holds the heme in place in these heme A containing proteins. Now even more stable connection between the protein component and the cofactor is given when we deal with heme C, because besides here are a couple of methyl groups here and propionic acid residues, we actually have covalent bonds to cysteine residues coming from the protein. So these are 2 covalent bonds that hold our heme in place in these heme C containing proteins. Okay, so you may remember that, I guess Dr. Baker has talked about this, that this porphyrin ring system is a quite delocalized electron system, and we can excite these electrons quite easily. Okay, and that's why we actually see a red color in these heme-containing components. That's what actually makes our blood red. Okay. Now, depending on the substituents about our porphyrin ring system, we have slightly different absorbance characteristics. associated with these different hemes, and also based on the protein components that these protein environments that these hemes are found in, we have slightly different absorbance characteristics, and based on these characteristics we can specify which heme we are actually dealing with, and also can use these spectral properties to distinguish the different cytochromes. So in the range of around 400 nanometers and above, up to about 600 nanometers, cytochromes have characteristic absorbance bands, which in the reduced state actually show 3 maxima here. And these are called the alpha, beta, and the gamma Sorey band. Okay, so this is the so-called Sorey band of the researcher who characterized this first. In the reduced state, we actually see 2 distinguishable peaks here for the alpha and the beta. In the oxidized state, actually this shows more like 1 peak here. In the reduced state, especially the alpha band can be utilized to distinguish different types of hemes we find in these cytochromes, and also distinguish different cytochromes. So here we have a table that shows that, for example, cytochrome C has an absorbance maximum here for the alpha band 550 nanometers, and cytochrome C1, okay, so that's the protein I referred to previously, which is part of complex 3, has a slightly different absorbance maximum here at 554, pretty close, but it's different. Okay? And based on these alpha bands, we can distinguish these different hemes and different proteins. Okay, so let's come back to complex 3. Here we have outlined these broken lines, the second monomer in this homodimer, and shown in a little bit more detail are the 3 subunits in a monomer that participate in electron transfer. So we see here again the Rieske iron sulfur protein with the 2 iron 2 sulfur cluster. We see in green here cytochrome B, which has, as the name implies, heme B, not just 1 actually, but 2, which also have been given different names, but here they are shown as BL and BH. And then we have the cytochrome C1, again don't confuse this with cytochrome C, which is a heme C containing protein. I would like to point out that we also have 2 binding sites for ubiquinone, which are located one more towards the matrix side, so the N side. Remember this terminology, N side refers to negative side because we have removed positive charges from the matrix side by transporting protons across the inner mitochondrial membrane, therefore it's more negative here on this side. And we have another ubiquinone binding site more towards the P side, which is more positive because we have transported protons to this side. And then we also have a binding site for our second mobile electron carrier, cytochrome C. Okay, so it's also shown in this broken line, which also has a heme type C. Okay, so electrons are transferred from ubiquinone, and we'll see how that works in a moment. Wire these different prosthetic groups in complex 3 here to cytochrome C. So cytochrome C, as we'll see in a little bit more detail later, only has 1 heme group and can only accept 1 electron at a time. So it has 1 central iron, which can go from the iron 3+ to the iron 2+ state. So 1 cytochrome C can only take up 1 electron. We transferred it from complex 3 to complex 4. Okay. That actually takes more than 1 electron, 1 cytochrome C here then to, for example, just accept both of the electrons coming from 1 ubiquinone. Okay. So I mentioned previously that 3 of the 4 complexes in the electron transport chain, complex 1, 3, and 4, transfer protons from the matrix side to the intermembrane sphere. Remember that? Now, complex 3 is the complex where this coupling between electron transfer and proton transport across the inner mitochondrial membrane is somewhat better understood. Okay, it has been this coupling and this process has been named the Q cycle, and the Q cycle is shown on this slide, and we start on the left side, so it includes different phases. Okay, so again, here we have one monomer of the homodimer of complex 3. We have the 3 protein subunits that participate in electron transfer. We see cytochrome C being bound on the binding side towards the intermembrane space. And we see one reduced coenzyme Q, so a ubiquinol, that actually is bound to the P side here, which is not really shown here, and donates electrons to our complex 3. So, how does this work? We have one fully reduced ubiquinol donating first 1 electron. We don't know what the how this works, whether both electrons are given up simultaneously or one first and the other then, no idea. But one of these 2 electrons of the fully reduced ubiquinol is given to the iron sulfur cluster in our Rieske iron sulfur protein. Okay? So the iron in this iron sulfur cluster changes from iron 3 plus to iron 2 plus, and then the iron 2 plus donates the electron to the heme C in cytochrome C1. There, the iron is reduced from iron 3 plus to iron 2 plus, and this iron 2 plus donates the electron, transfers the electron to cytochrome C, or second mobile electron carrier. Okay, iron 3 plus here in cytochrome C is reduced to iron 2 plus. The reduced cytochrome C dissociates from the binding side and transports this electron to complex 4. Now at this point, we would be dealing with a partially reduced ubiquinol, okay, which has another electron, and this other electron, which is also called the cycling electron, is given to one of these heme Bs in our cytochrome B, okay? From there, it's given to the other heme B, and from there, it's actually given to another molecule of ubiquinone, we find found on the other side, another binding side, which was oxidized, okay, but is now, by taking up 1 electron, being partially reduced. We found the semiquinone radical. This first ubiquinone, besides just giving up the 2 electrons, is also giving up its 2 protons, and these 2 protons are released into the intermembrane space. And here we see this coupling between electron transport and release of protons into the intermembrane space. Now this is only the first phase, because what happens now is another ubiquinol, a reduced ubiquinol, binds, gives up 1 electron to another molecule of cytochrome C via the iron sulfur cluster here in the Rieske iron sulfur protein via cytochrome C1, okay? Gives up another electron, which is transferred via our hemes B to our semiquinone form of the second molecule of ubiquinone, which not only takes up this second electron, but also takes up 2 protons from the matrix side to be fully reduced. So what we have then also is that another 2 protons from the second molecule of ubiquinol are released to the intermembrane space. So what we have produced really is, or what we have done is we oxidize 2 molecules of ubiquinol, and we have produced actually 1 molecule of ubiquinol here. So our net equation can then be formulated as shown here, that we actually, as a net result, oxidized 1 ubiquinol, okay, really produced oxidized 2, but we also produced 1. And we have transferred 2 electrons, okay, coming from ubiquinol molecules to a total of 2 molecules of cytochrome C. And in this process, we also have released into the intermembrane space 4 protons. Okay? So that's known as the Q cycle. Here are 2 representations of cytochrome C. Again, say it's probably too often. This is stick also a second mobile electron carrier. Top of the surface control representation, which also shows where the heme prothetic group is located. A ribbon diagram at the bottom. It shows that we have a couple of alpha helices actually in this protein. About 40% of the overall amino acid sequence is found in alpha helices, and the rest of beta turns and loops, all unstructured. It's not a particularly big protein, has a molecular weight of only about 12.4 or so kilodaltons, about 100 amino acid residues long. But what is important is that we also have this pathetic group, heme, and the central iron can take up electrons and donate electrons, and that will be important now when we talk about how electrons are actually transferred to oxygen, because this happens in complex 4. So we transfer these electrons that are now cytochrome C in the heme group to oxygen, which is our ultimate electron acceptor, and oxygen actually requires 4 electrons, molecular oxygen I should say, and 2 protons to be fully reduced to water. So in order to fully reduce 1 molecule of oxygen to water, we actually need 4 cytochrome C molecules to transfer electrons from complex 3 to complex 4. So keep that in mind, okay? And this is also shown on this slide here, which shows a couple of things. I'll walk you through this in a moment. But remember that we need 4 individual cytochrome Cs coming from complex 3 to bind to complex 4. Each of these individual cytochrome C molecules will donate its electron, and these electrons will ultimately be accepted by oxygen. Oxygen not only takes up 4 electrons, but also 2 protons actually, okay? And here it's formulated as 2 more water molecules that are produced, okay? So we need 4 hydrogen, and it's reduced to water, okay? So, you may remember that in this overview slide that showed the Mitchell hypothesis, that for complex 4, only 2 protons are being transported from the matrix to the intermembrane space, and I pointed out that you may see different numbers. You shouldn't get confused by this. So these 2 that were shown in this overview slide referred to pair of electrons that is being transported in the electron transport chain. Now here, since we are talking about 4 electrons being utilized to fully reduce oxygen to water, we need 2 pairs of electrons, and for that reason it's also shown that we have a transport of a total of 4 protons across the inner mitochondrial membrane through complex 4. So don't get confused. Okay, so when we talk about how many protons are being transported or pumped across the inner mitochondrial membrane, we usually refer this to a pair of electrons. That's what we utilize to do all the calculations and such that we're going to do in a moment. But here we show something slightly different because we show the full reduction of oxygen. So complex 4 is also relatively big, about 200 kilodaltons molecular weight, has something like 13 or 14 subunits, on different numbers here. What is important here also is Then again we have a couple of subunits that participate here in the electron transport and cofactors in the form of hemes, particular of type A, and also copper ions. So we have so-called copper centers and copper ions, where the copper can change between copper 2 plus and copper 1 plus, as I pointed out previously. It's actually one of these coppers here in the subunit 2 that first accepts an electron from one cytochrome C, donates it to another copper. Then the second copper actually donates an electron to the heme A here in this yellow subunit, which then donates the electron to a heme that is in close proximity, actually in complex with a copper and forms a heme copper center. And from this heme copper center then the electron is donated to oxygen. Okay. So this happens 4 times. 4 individual cytochrome C proteins bind here to complex 4, donate their electrons. Molecular oxygen takes up a total of 4 electrons. To produce 2 water molecules, we also need 4 protons, and we produce water. In this process, also protons are pumped across the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay, so now that we understand how electrons are transferred from NADH and FADH2 respectively to oxygen, and how where protons are being pumped across the inner mitochondrial membrane, let's talk about how this proton motive force that is built up by producing this proton gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this actually requires a discussion here of the large protein complex known as ATP synthase. As I said, I think before spring break, this ATP synthase often is referred to also as complex 5, okay? Because this protein complex that is embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane, or at least part of it. And I also talked about this nomenclature that describes the 2 big parts that make this protein complex. One can be called FO or F0 or not or whatever. I told you that I typically call it FO because it can be inhibited by oligomycin. I guess that's how it got its name originally, but I'm not sure. So many people call it F0, okay? And then it contains another big part. So these are not individual subunits, so terminology is a little bit difficult here. But another rather big part also that is referred to as F1. And we'll see in more detail that protons that are now in higher concentration in the intermembrane space can travel across the inner mitochondrial membrane through this FO or F0 portion of ATP synthase, and then this F1 portion actually is able to catalyze the phosphorylation of ADP to ATP. I told you before that this chemiosmotic theory was rather controversial for many, many years. But pretty much all experimental, or a lot of experimental evidence actually supports it. There are many, many experiments that you could discuss that support electron transport and the coupling of electron transport with the phosphorylation of ADP to ATP under aerobic conditions. So I'll just briefly talk about 2 experiments that support the chemiosmotic theory. Here we see a result that you can obtain with isolated mitochondria. If you have, and I've done experiments like this. Remember I told you about this professor that wanted to show that the chemiosmotic theory is wrong. We work with isolated mitochondria, and you expose these mitochondria to all kinds of compounds, and then you measure things like ATP synthesis and also whether or not oxygen is being consumed. So the results we got never pleased our professor. I think they were more in agreement with the chemiosmotic theory, but never mind. So this one actually is a classic example where you measure ATP synthesis and consumption of oxygen. So consumption of oxygen means that oxygen is being reduced to water. Okay, that we have an active electron transport from NADH or FADH2 to oxygen, and oxygen is being reduced to water, so oxygen, molecular oxygen is being consumed. ATP, if synthesized, means that we utilize, under these conditions, produce a proton motive force, and that is utilized for ATP production. And these two things, electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation, are closely coupled. Okay. So if we just measure oxygen consumption and ATP synthesis with isolated mitochondria that really haven't been given anything, we will not measure any significant increase. So if we add ADP and inorganic phosphate, so I guess this may be an artifact, or I'm not sure what this is supposed to be, but it's rather flat. Okay. But if you add succinate, we have an increase of both oxygen consumption, so meaning electron transport, and ATP synthesis. Why? Simple question. What happens? According to the chemiosmotic theory, can you speak up a little?
It's the transferable, the succinate is the transferable electron.
Succinate is being oxidized to fumarate, right? Succinate dehydrogenase. We produce an FADH2 in complex 2, and from there electrons are being transferred to oxygen. So we consume oxygen then because it's reduced to water, and we also produce then a proton motive force and produce ATP. Okay. Now, if we add cyanide, okay, told you to remember this, cyanide can actually poison the heme groups in our electron transport chain. Okay, that we will not be able to actually do these redox reactions that we need to do. And this all comes to a stop when we do not produce more ATP or consume more oxygen. Okay, so experiments like this actually showed this coupling of oxidative phosphorylation. Now there are, and I think there's a table in your textbook, there are a number of different compounds that you can use to more specifically poison individual components of the electron transport chain. If you're interested, look these up. I don't expect you to remember these or so, but be aware of the fact that this has a long history and a number of compounds that can be utilized for individually knocking out components, more or less individually, of the electron transport chain. So another type of compounds actually that shows this coupling of electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation is shown in the next slide, and these are so-called uncouplers. Okay, and uncouplers can be weak acids, weak hydrophobic acids, such as dinitrophenol, that is shown here, or similar compounds. And what these compounds can do is they can accept and donate protons. Okay, there are weak acids conjugate bases. Here we have the phenolate anionic form of dinitrophenol, which is the conjugate base. It can accept a proton, okay, be converted into the acid form, which is very hydrophobic, doesn't have a charge here, okay, and can diffuse through membranes, okay, because it's hydrophobic enough. Remember, if something is hydrophobic, it can actually be transported via diffusion through biological membranes. Now on the other side of this membrane, then we can have the reverse reaction. Donation of a proton in the acidic form is converted into the conjugate base form. Okay, and this can go either direction. And if this happens, for example, in mitochondria, we dissipate the proton gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane, okay, and okay, we don't have a proton multiforcing. Now, what you have to understand is that even if you have compounds like this uncouplers present, that, or especially if you have uncouplers present, that your body will break down nutrients for energy production because you don't produce ATP under such conditions, at least not under aerobic conditions. So you will continue to break down nutrients, but you will not increase the concentration of ATP, at least not via oxidative phosphorylation. And in the early days, relatively early days of biochemistry, I guess people already realized, and I think not on a strict scientific basis, that certain compounds can actually be utilized as diet pills. Okay, and in the early days of biochemistry, people realized already that that's not a good idea to do, and one of the pioneers of the electron transport chain, Ephraim Rucker, actually summarized this in a book following way. So he describes this scenario as the results were striking. Unfortunately, in some cases, the treatment eliminated not only the fat but also the patients. Okay, so this is not healthy. Okay, so in the 1920s, quite a number of fatalities were reported, and these people took uncouplers to lose weight, so don't do that. Now there is a natural uncoupler actually, which is a protein that has originally been called thermogenin. And thermogenin is found in the brown fat tissue of newborns. And the purpose there is to uncouple oxidative phosphorylation electron transport for heat production. Okay, so uncoupling not necessarily always is a bad thing. Okay, in newborns it's important to keep little ones warm, suppose. But then later, don't swallow any uncouplers if you want to lose fat. Okay, body weight is not wrong. Okay, so let's take a look at ATP synthase, or complex 5, also known. It's a big protein complex, okay, has in mammals at least 16 subunits or so, has a molecular weight of more than 500,000, so this is big. And it's so big that it can actually be visualized with an electron microscope here, and we see that it has this lollipop structure, a knob and stalk structure, where our knobs actually extend here into the mitochondrial matrix. So part of the protein, primarily the FO part, is embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. There is arms, subunits here, which interact then also with the F1 part. And the F1 part also contains a number of subunits, among others, two subunits called alpha and beta subunits that form a hexameric ring. Okay, and via the interaction with these subunits here shown in golden, this ring here, this hexameric ring, is held stationary. And in the center, or extending to the center of this hexameric stationary ring, is a piston-like protein, gamma subunit, which interacts via the epsilon subunit here with part of the FO portion of ATP synthase. And we already see here, indicated by these arrows, that as protons actually are transferred via the FO portion here of ATP synthase from the P side here, so this would be the intermembrane side, back to the matrix, we induce a rotation, counterclockwise rotation here, which is transferred also to this gamma piston, and we have a rotation of this gamma piston within the stationary hexameric ring formed by the alpha and beta subunits. Okay. And this rotation is very important because it induces conformational changes in the beta subunits, which enable ATP synthase then to phosphorylate ADP and produce ATP. Okay, so that these two parts of ATP synthase, the FO part and the F1 part, have different properties. Namely, one, the ability to transfer electrons across the membrane, and the other to phosphorylate ATP to produce ATP or act as an ATP synthase in that sense, can be shown by separating these two. So if we take mitochondria and form first such inside-out vesicles and then apply some shearing force or mechanical agitation, we can actually shear off the F1 part and then are left with the FO part or F0 part in these membranous vesicles, and then we can demonstrate that these FO portions are still able to transport protons across the membrane, okay, but they don't have ATP synthase activity. And we can actually show that the F1 parts they don't have ATP synthesis activity, but they can hydrolyze ATP. Remember, enzymes can catalyze the forward and the reverse reaction. So here it's the reverse reaction that is actually done by these particles. And if we reconstitute then these two, we have both electron transport and ATP synthase activity. Okay, so how can we explain what's going on here? There's a model that has been called the binding change mechanism of ATP synthesis. And what this tells us, and I'll show you a little video that shows it, explains it a little better. But what this binding change mechanism here tells us is that all three beta subunits that we find in our hexameric ring of alpha and beta subunits can go through different conformations as the gamma piston actually rotates in our hexameric ring. And we can distinguish different conformations, and according to this binding change mechanism, there are at least 3 different conformations. Whether we really have these distinct 3, I don't know. We don't hear about these in the little video clip that I'm going to show you in a moment. But according to this mechanism here, we go through 3 different conformations that we can call open conformation, the loose conformation, the tight conformation. And all 3 subunits here shown, only the beta subunits, this one, this one, and this one, go through these different conformations as our gamma piston rotates a full rotation 360 degrees. Okay. So first, if we just focus on this yellow subunit, we start out in the open conformation. We have some loose interactions, ADP and manganese phosphate. We can bind ADP and manganese phosphate, go to the loose conformation where the interaction is tighter, ADP and manganese phosphate are bound, and then we go through the tight conformation. In this process, we have enabled this beta subunit to phosphorylate ADP and produce ATP, and then as we go back to the open conformation, we dissociate the ATP. Okay. So it takes about 4 protons to go through the ATP synthase to produce 1 molecule of ATP. Now, you may remember, again, that complex 1 and 3 pump 4 protons each per pair of electrons that go through the electron transport chain. And complex 4 only pumps 2 protons. So if electrons enter the electron transfer chain that come from mitochondrial NADH, all of these 3 proton pumping complexes will pump protons, and the number of protons pumped then per pair of electrons that came from mitochondrial NADH is 10. So if we do the calculation then for this, for each molecule of NADH that is oxidized to NAD+, mitochondrial NADH I should point out, we can produce 2.5 molecules of ATP. Now since FADH2 enters the electron transport chain past complex 1, okay, if it comes from succinate, it will be through complex 2, which does not pump electrons. We only pump protons then, that's a protons and electrons before. We only pump protons in complex 3 and 4, 4 in complex 3, 2 in complex 4. So we only have pumped 6 protons, meaning that a molecule of FADH2 will be good to produce 1.5 molecules of ATP. And that's where these numbers come from. I think it's relatively difficult to determine such things. In other textbooks you find 3 and 2 here, but this is what your textbook tells you. So if we do the calculation then for a molecule of glucose that is broken down under aerobic conditions, okay? We see that, we produce 2 molecules of pyruvate. These 2 molecules of pyruvate can be converted to 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA, and each of these molecules of acetyl-CoA can be channeled into the citric acid cycle. Okay? So for that reason, these numbers actually have to be multiplied by 2, okay, because we produce 2 molecules of NADH, of 2 molecules of pyruvate, excuse me, acetyl-CoA. So if we just look at the energetics of glycolysis, we've seen that also under anaerobic conditions, but also under aerobic conditions, we produce 2 molecules of ATP. Okay, but we also produce 2 molecules of NADH, which under anaerobic conditions didn't do us any good, energy-wise, but under aerobic conditions can be utilized to produce ATP. Now this is cytosolic NADH that is produced in glycolysis, so we have to use either the malate aspartate shuttle system to utilize these electrons, and then it's 1 for 1 pretty much, okay, meaning we utilize then after utilizing the cytosolic NADH, we utilize pretty much a mitochondrial NADH that has been produced in mitochondrial matrix, and we can get 2.5 molecules of ATP for that. Okay? If we use the glycerol 3-phosphate shuttle, I told you we produce actually an FADH2, and the electrons then enter the electron transport chain past complex 1, and we only get 1.5 molecules of ATP. Times 2 would make 3, and that's why you have 2 different numbers here for the cytosolic NADH that is produced in the breakdown of 1 molecule of glucose. Then we produce 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA in the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex reaction. Each of these produces an NADH. Okay, this happens in the mitochondrial matrix, so they produce 5 ATPs. We have in the citric acid cycle 3 steps to produce NADH, times 2 is 6, times 2.5 is 15. We produce per acetyl-CoA 1 FADH2 times 2 gives us 3 ATPs, and we produce per acetyl-CoA 1 ATP equivalent, either ATP or GTP, times 2 gives us 2 ATPs. So from 1 molecule of glucose, we can actually get either 30 or 32, depending on the shuttle system we use for the cytosolic NADH, molecules of ATP. So 15 or 16 times more than we can get under anaerobic conditions. Okay, so our efficiency is actually quite a bit higher. Okay, so since oxidative phosphorylation is so important, to produce so much ATP, we also have to regulate whether we have to do this at full speed all the time or not. And the major factor that regulates to what degree we actually have oxidative phosphorylation occur is by the availability of ADP. ADP is a substrate for the oxidative phosphorylation, and therefore we can call this acceptor control. If there's a lot of ADP, okay, we will have a high rate of oxidative phosphorylation occur, and this increase can be by a factor of 10 compared to base level. Okay, and that's called the acceptor control ratio. So overall, it's the so-called mass action ratio that is decisive here. So how much ATP do we have compared to ADP? Okay. Now this ratio doesn't fluctuate too much, but as we get the accumulation of ADP, we will increase to try to produce ATP. Now in reality, what is also important is, do we have enough NADH, okay, that we can oxidize, and also how much cytochrome C can we actually produce that is reduced to increase the rate of ATP production. Okay, so ADP we've seen previously as an allosteric modulator of a number of regulatory proteins and metabolism. This is shown in this overview slide, starting actually with glycolysis. Okay, then we've seen that the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex also is activated by ADP. So there are a number of regulatory enzymes that are actually activated by ADP. It's not just the oxidative phosphorylation that is increased, but everything that leads to that pretty much. Also, we've also seen that ATP, as it accumulates, will inhibit catabolism. Makes sense. If we have enough of what we need, okay, why not slow down first? So the ATP that is being produced with oxidative phosphorylation can be transported to the intermembrane space of the cytosol and be utilized for energy production as needed. And ADP can be transported across the inner mitochondrial membrane for phosphorylation purposes by ATP synthase. So there's a transport, an antiporter that transports ADP and ATP, an antiport. And then there's also a phosphate transporter, phosphate translocase, which can transport phosphate from the intermembrane space of the cytosol to the matrix for phosphorylation purposes. And this is actually the symport also with protons. So I told you previously there are a couple of transport systems in the inner mitochondrial membrane that actually utilize this gradient, this proton gradient. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Just enough time to show you this little video that I wanted to show you about ATP production.
We are looking at the turning gamma subunit and the epsilon subunits, and there's the C ring in the membrane. The F1 complex is outside of the membrane, while the F0 complex is embedded in the membrane. There's the stalk, including the delta and the B subunits. The alpha subunits are shown in light pink. The beta subunits are magenta. In the middle, the central stalk is rotating. The B subunit stabilizes the hexamer, which means that the hexamer can't rotate. We will now look at a rendering of known structural states and the conformational changes that are happening. The beta subunits are seen as a ribbon diagram. The ADP and inorganic phosphate diffuse into the active site, and the ATP has just been released. And simultaneously, the conformational change occurs in the beta subunit. If we zoom into the active site, we can see the molecular structure of the substrates and the chemical reaction. Here is ADP with its 2 phosphates. They are all held in place by a network of hydrogen bonds mediated by the amino acids in the folded structure of the beta subunit. Hydrogen bonds stabilize the base and the sugar, but really primarily the base. There's also a magnesium ion that plays a critical role in not just stabilizing, but also neutralizing the charge of the phosphates. Notice the conformational changes that are happening when the inorganic phosphate comes in. There is the promotion of a planar transition state. Synthesis of a new phosphodiester bond is catalyzed, and then the subunit switches to the open conformation. Upon this reconfiguration in the beta subunit, ATP is ejected from the active site. The enzyme then resets and restarts the synthesis of another ATP molecule. This is a summary of the events at the active site. It is also intriguing just how the C ring rotates. We can start with the analogy of a water wheel. We can easily grasp the idea of how a water wheel rotates. It's driven by the flow of water, allowing the wooden fins to go in a particular direction. Thus, the rotation happens in a specific direction. If the water was to flow in the opposite direction, you would see rotation of the water wheel in the opposite direction. Here we see the C ring and the A subunit. We don't know the full structure of the A subunit, but we know that there's an access channel for protons on the A subunit right in the intermembrane space. And there's a separate egress channel for protons on the matrix side. In this animation, you see protons flowing out from an interface between the C ring and the A subunit. But what drives the specific direction of this rotation? For example, if we were looking down, it is always a counterclockwise rotation. Why, and what drives that? On each of the C subunits within the C ring, there is a proton binding site. Notice the high concentration of protons on the intermembrane side, and their flow to the lower concentration on the matrix side. Protons load from the highly concentrated intermembrane side onto the C subunits, and they are released on the matrix side where the concentration of the protons is low. But why can't protons go around the other way as well? In principle, just as in the water wheel analogy, the C ring should be able to rotate in either direction, shouldn't it? There are two interconnected reasons for this unidirectional movement. The amino acid side chains in C subunits would repel the bound proton, so that when a proton loads from the intermembrane side, the C ring cannot rotate back in the opposite direction because it is energetically unfavorable. Rotating counterclockwise, on the other hand, is energetically favorable because there are no repulsive interactions. Remember, there's a concentration gradient that favors binding of protons on the intermembrane side and the release of protons on the matrix side. So in summary, the proton gradient determines the direction of the rotation, favoring movement in the counterclockwise direction of the C ring. This avoids unfavorable interactions with the amino acid side chains of the C ring.
Okay, so let me show you real quick one more thing. It takes only a couple of seconds. Namely the visualization of the rotation by tagging actually the ATP synthase with fluorophores or gold particles can also be used. So there's a tail attached pretty much to the ATP synthase, the F1 part. And this is a real molecule of ATP synthase. It has this kind of rotation. Okay? Okay, so see you on Thursday.